Okay, Glenda, thanks for inviting me. We've only known each other 18 years. You're the first person to come visit me in my office in DC when I started working at the National Audubon Society. So it's been fun working with you ever since. And
Thank you.
look forward to meeting everybody that we're talking to tonight. Hopefully somewhere on the Potomac River as Waterbird season is starting. So I have a very simple tale to tell you. About 100 years ago, people figured out that all the ducks and geese fly along these four flyways. You've got the Pacific Flyway, the Central Flyway near the Rocky Mountains. You've got the Mississippi Flyway that includes the Great Lakes. And then you've got the Atlantic Flyway that we're part of. And so this has been gospel for 100 years, so it's got to be true, right? Unfortunately, the birds don't read our books. And so the waterfowl, the ducks and the geese, and the other water birds fly any way they want to go. And we'll show you some of the different migratory routes that some of our birds use. But it's not anywhere nearly as organized as those flyway maps would like to show you, even though that's still how we organize bird conservation in the United States and Canada. We'll start out a little bit away from the Potomac River, and this is the prairie potholes region. And you can see that includes 3 provinces in Canada and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 states in the United States. And at the bottom here, you'll see that it includes Iowa. But I had a father-in-law who was a farmer in Iowa, and his job was to tile all the fields so that he could grow corn instead of having wetlands. And so Iowa has withdrawn from the prairie potholes region, but most of this other region still has some very important wetlands for a whole variety of water birds. And that's important because here's a picture of the range of American widgeon. And the dark blue is where they breed, and you'll see the middle arrow is pointing right at the prairie potholes. And the wintering area includes us along the Atlantic coast. They go all the way down to the northern part of South America. But they start out in the prairie potholes and they spread out all across the United States, Central America, Mexico, and Northern South America. And so the prairie potholes is really one of the primary breeding grounds for water birds all through the Americas. So I'll switch back to our focus today, which is the Potomac River. And I like to start with this map because if you look on the left-hand side, you can see the South Fork of the South Branch of the Potomac River. And in the mid-1700s, some guy named Butcher showed up there from either Germany or Scotland. We're still trying to figure out which, probably Scotland, and settled right along the South Fork of the South Branch, just inside the West Virginia line, which of course at the time was still part of Virginia. And our family stayed there until the mid-1900s when my dad joined the Navy and his sisters all moved to Norfolk, Virginia to help out with the war effort. If you look farther to the right, you'll see Washington, D.C. And most of what I'm going to focus on is actually south of Washington, D.C. You can see a little curve there. We'll show that to you a little bit more. And that's what we call the lower Potomac River important bird area. And that's the focus of what I want to talk about today. The interesting thing is just to the left of Washington, D.C. is Great Falls. And Great Falls is really important because above the falls, there's no tide. Below the falls, it is tidal. So all of Washington, D.C. and everything south and east of Washington, D.C. is tidal, although it's freshwater tidal. And I'm not quite sure where Chesapeake Bay, Potomac River turns completely fresh, but obviously there's a fresh to brackish gradient as you go out the Potomac River and into Chesapeake Bay, and out of Chesapeake Bay into the Atlantic Ocean. Things go from totally fresh to totally salt. And someday do a little research, or we can ask somebody on the webinar tonight about exactly how that transition takes place. But it matters a lot to the ducks because some ducks prefer fresh water, some prefer salt water, and same for the other water birds. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the lower Potomac River important bird area. This area has been adopted by Audubon Society of Northern Virginia, and we're trying to do as much conservation in this region as we can. The picture is Julie Metz Wetlands, which is now part of Neabsco Creek Wetlands, where there's a brand new boardwalk. which I hope you all have visited or will visit soon. It's just a great place to walk over the wetlands. And as I say, waterbird season, winter waterbird season is starting. So between now and Christmas, all kinds of different waterbirds will be either migrating through or starting to spend the winter in a place like Julie Metz wetlands. This is a map of the important bird area. It starts just south of Alexandria. And I have to apologize to this group because we made Dyke Marsh #2, and there's no reason we couldn't have made it #1, and we should have. #1 is Huntley Meadows, and that's just an accident of numbering. If you look all the way to the south, you can see King George County, Virginia is part of the important bird area, but we don't know anything about the important sites within the important bird area. So if anybody here knows anything about King George County, Virginia, and good sites for birds along the Potomac River, please let us know. I have a key to these other sites, which I won't go through tonight, but if you want to know more about each of these locations, these are all public properties. They're almost all you can see east of Route 1 and I-95. The exception is Prince William Forest Park. Almost everything else is between the river and the big highways that dominate that part of the Potomac River. So as I say, we're south of DC, we're south of Alexandria, and we're heading down to King George County, but we're not going anywhere close to Chesapeake Bay for the conversation tonight. So Virginia has 20 important bird areas. These were identified about 20 years ago. And if you look at that little C in the northeast part of the map, you can see that this is really the only important bird area in Virginia on the Potomac River. So it's been decided that that is the most important place for waterbird conservation on the Potomac River in Virginia. So that's why we're putting a lot of effort into trying to do as much conservation in this area as we can. The really fabulous thing is that for 30 years, there's a whole group of volunteers that have been collecting information about all this area. And a lot of the information is coming from Occoquan Bay National Wildlife Refuge. On the lower left, you can see Julie Metz wetlands again. The Laurel Hill, Lorton Regional Park area, Occoquan Regional Park area, which is on a tributary of the Potomac River. And then Meadowood Special Recreation Area, which is an inland site that has a lot of varied habitat. And Jim Wagoner has been leading this group for 30 years now and has a bunch of friends who've been doing it for many of them for the same 30 years he has. The other really cool thing is that Jim Wagoner is also one of the major people responsible for the birth of Occoquan Bay National Wildlife Refuge. So he's a citizen scientist and a conservationist and has really helped us to understand and to save what we've got in this region. So here's a map that's really focused in on some of these key areas. You can see Lorton, Laurel Hill, Occoquan Regional Park is just a little bit north of I-95 and Route 1. I think that's the Occoquan River there, but I'm not positive. You can see Meadowood in here is the inland parts. Powick Bay Regional Park is on Gunston Cove and Powick Bay. Then you've got Occoquan Bay National Wildlife Refuge, Metz Wetlands, which, as I say, is now called Neabsco Creek Wetlands. And then I'm going to talk quite a bit about Mason Neck National Wildlife Refuge and Mason Neck State Park because of their importance for waterfowl as well. And here is a focus on Mason Neck. You can see on the northwest here is Belmont Bay. On the other side of Belmont Bay is Occoquan Bay National Wildlife Refuge. So you can see all the same birds in Belmont Bay, one from each side. And if your telescope and eyes are really good, you can see all the same ducks. Otherwise, it's nice to cover both sides. So Mason Neck State Park has a ridge up here, cliffs overlooking Belmont Bay. So it's great to take a telescope, stand on the ridge and look into the bay to see all the ducks you can see. And it's just starting up now, so it keeps getting better and better into November and December, and it stays really good unless Belmont Bay ices over, in which case the birds head out and are much harder to see. And then on the southeast side here is the Occoquan Bay, the Mason Neck National Wildlife Refuge. And here you can see in gray this great marsh. And there's two hikes out to Great Marsh. There's the Wood Marsh Trail, which is a little bit longer, and there's the Great Marsh Trail, which is a little bit shorter, and it has a better pavement. And at both ends, you have really nice viewing platforms, and you can have a really cool look out on Great Marsh, which is one of the world's great places for seeing tundra swans in the wintertime. So keep your eyes and ears open for when the tundra swans return to Great Marsh, and be sure to get out and hike out there and get a look at those, as well as, of course, a whole bunch of other water birds as well. You can see here that Occoquan Bay National Wildlife Refuge is kind of the best spot in this area for birds. Metz Wetlands is second, and basically being on the Potomac River is really good for bird diversity, as is habitat diversity. So Occoquan Bay National Wildlife Refuge has a great habitat diversity and is good year-round for birds, although a little bit quiet in June, July, and August. We have a winter waterfowl survey that we've been doing for, I don't know, something like 10 years. It now covers the entire Potomac River, starting from Algonquian Park, which is in Loudoun County, all the way out to the Chesapeake Bay. It used to not go quite as far as the Chesapeake Bay, but that's been added on lately. A few inland water bodies are included, such as Burke Lake, and it's done annually in 2020 when it's February 8th or 9th, and I don't know for 2022, but keep your eyes open for the announcement for the Winter Waterfowl Survey. It includes Dyke Marsh, a couple of areas on Mason Neck, Occoquan Refuge, and Veterans Memorial Park, which is right next door. And it's coordinated by Larry Cartwright. That's his email, but feel free to contact a bunch of us and we'll get you in touch with Larry if you would like to participate in early February this year. So the waterbird populations in our area vary from year to year. They obviously vary seasonally, so that the peak is probably December, probably between Thanksgiving and Christmas. But there are waterbirds, of course, in the area year round. We have breeding waterbirds that I'll talk about in a bit. But the amount of submerged aquatic vegetation varies a lot in the Potomac River. When there's a lot of SAV, as we call it, or SAV, the numbers of ducks and shorebirds actually increase. We had a high amount of SAV in August and September of 2016, and we saw a huge number of shorebirds, the like of which we don't see in most years. The last few winters have been down because of rain, we think, but again, we don't completely understand why the SAV increases some years, goes down in other years, but when it's here, it's really good. So we always tell you to not promote invasive plants, but in this case, there's an invasive plant called hydrilla that's part of the SAV, which actually is attractive to ducks and shorebirds. So there's always an exception to every rule. We don't quite understand how water pollution affects SAV. So of course, we're very concerned about water pollution in the Potomac River, and we're really pleased that Alexandria will be improving its sewage treatment and stormwater runoff treatment over the next 10 years. And we think that will help clean up the Potomac River, and it will probably affect the numbers of waterbirds and shorebirds we attract, and we're not completely sure how it will affect the numbers. We know it will improve the health of all the birds that use the Potomac. You might remember in the old days when there was a lot of ice on the Potomac, and especially on the bays and on the tributaries leading into the Potomac. That's still possible. And obviously when things ice in, the waterbirds get pushed out and we have to change where we look for them. The other surprising thing that affects our waterbirds a lot is Canadian ice, and especially Great Lakes ice. If the Great Lakes ice over, which often happens in February, we often get a whole big influx of new waterbirds coming down. And we've had redneck grebes are a species that shows up usually only in numbers when the Great Lakes freeze over. There's also more scaup and other diving ducks that show up in greater numbers after the Canadian ice freezes over, or the Great Lakes freeze over. There have also been historical things that affect waterbird abundance. In the late 1800s, there was market hunting, especially along the Atlantic coast. I'm certain along the Potomac River as well. Chesapeake Bay, we know, is a very popular market hunting site. And that led to the Migratory Bird Treaty in early 1900s. And as the Fish and Wildlife Service established hunting bag limits and seasons to limit the take of ducks and geese, especially, and rails as well are targets of hunters at times. So even after the water birds improved in population due to these activities, in the 1930s, there was a drought in the Dust Bowl in the Southwest United States, but also drought in the prairie potholes. The map I showed you of North Central United States and South Central Canada, and the duck numbers just really dropped dramatically because of the drought in the prairie potholes primarily. So at that time, people tried to think of a number of ways to restore duck populations. So they came up with a duck stamp, and if you buy a duck stamp, I think it's $25, that money goes 100% into buying up wetlands for conservation. So not just for ducks, but, and that's what I call it, the not just for duck stamp, because it helps preserve wetlands for all water birds. And so sometimes the local post office will carry that. Almost every refuge carries it. So buy a duck stamp, it gets you free admission to national wildlife refuges. And it buys wetlands. It doesn't support duck hunting in any way, shape, or form. It supports conservation of wetlands. Waterfowl surveys were initiated, especially in the 1950s in Canada and the United States. So we understood how duck populations were going, whether they had successful breeding in the season or not. They tightened up the hunting regulations, and they used duck stamp and other money to expand refuges both in the United States and Canada. In the 1960s, air and water pollution had been dramatically increasing. The Environmental Protection Agency was invented in the early 1970s under President Richard Nixon. In case you need something positive to think about Richard Nixon, he started a whole lot of good environmental regulations in this country, including the Environmental Protection Agency. And of course, a big improvement on our sewage treatment beginning in the 60s especially, and hopefully continuing on into the future because we're not quite there yet. I'm going to stop for a moment for any questions that people might have about that information. And then I'm going to go kind of species by species to show you some of my favorite water birds that spend time here in the middle part of the Potomac River. So Carolyn, can you see if there's any questions or open it up if someone wants to ask something?
There are currently no questions in the chat, but I will throw out, I saw your map. You didn't have any places identified in King George County. Have you ever been to the Caledon State Park?
What's the name of it?
I'll put it in the chat.
Oh, good.
I'm not
There's
sure
also
about
the George Washington birthplace is wonderful at Pope's Creek.
They have water birds there?
Yep,
Oh, cool.
it overlooks the Potomac.
Yeah. Well, I do a waterfowl trip to the northern neck every winter, and LaGrange Lane is jackpot. It's right along the main highway there. You know, you're familiar with that, Dixie, right?
Yes.
LaGrange Lane is awesome. There's huge ponds on both sides of it. And then you can go out to George Washington birthplace, and there's roads there. You can go up and see sea ducks like scoters and goldeneye and
Longtail sometimes.
and long-tailed ducks. Yep.
So that's where the transition starts to take place, as far as the ducks are concerned, anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
And I
Because
just
those are all
wanna,
really rare up here.
Right. But there's plenty of loons and grebes also.
Cool.
We did get a question from Jeffrey Schwartz about whether the slides could be made available offline.
Sure. Yep. That'd be fine.
so we'll get those from you, Greg, and figure out how to let people have access.
That sounds good.
You
And,
mentioned the Alexandria sewer project,
yeah,
which is to deal with our combined sewer overflow. So those of us who live in Alexandria are seeing our charges for our water and sewer go up to pay for that. Also, DC has a major project, much bigger than Alexandria's, but the same problem. They're about halfway through. So when they get done and we get done, I think we should see a big improvement in the water quality in the Potomac.
yeah, and especially because the important bird area is just south of both Alexandria and DC. So that region will benefit the most. So we're really looking forward to that. And I'm going to walk away for a second because I know that fan drives Dixie crazy. So I'm going to go turn that fan off. I'll be right back.
It does. It makes your eyes go funny.
Oh, one thing I didn't mention for Northern Virginia Bird Club, we're going to have Bill Young do a Zoom meeting for our November meeting. So
Don't miss Bill. He's fantastic and he's
Yes.
really good with bird behavior. So I don't know if that's the focus of his talk.
I think it's going to be Africa.
Oh, wow.
Africa. Yeah. I think
But
so.
Bill gives great talks. So don't
But
miss
whatever
that.
it is, he's always awesome. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about specific species, a bit of an overview here. And I promised that I would talk about the difference between waterfowl and water birds. And so the answer for waterfowl is really simple because that's just geese, swans, and ducks. Everything else that we're going to talk about today is some kind of a water bird. But geese, swans, and ducks are called waterfowl. And these are the primary ones that are hunted every fall and winter. Grebes are water birds. Rails, coots, gallinules are water birds. They're also called webless game birds or secretive marsh birds. So there's all kinds of fun terminology that people use who work with these species. Then plovers and sandpipers are called shorebirds. In England, they're called waders. So that's really confusing because we call herons, egrets, bitterns, ibises, and spoonbills are what we call waders. If you go over to England, they think that plovers and sandpipers are waders. So that's kind of fun if you travel a little bit. And then gulls and terns are related to plovers and sandpipers, but we usually refer to them as colonial water birds. And colonial not because they come from the Revolutionary era, but colonial because they nest in groups.
Hi, Greg. This is Carolyn. Trudy has her hand raised.
Okay, Trudy. Can you come off mute?
Yes.
Oh, there you
Okay.
go.
I live at Porto Vecchio, which is north of Dyke Marsh.
Yeah.
And we've got a spoonbill who keeps visiting us. He or she has stayed here for quite a while.
Yeah, I came to see that. I really enjoyed it.
Why is a spoonbill here?
So spoonbills breed along the Gulf of Mexico coast. And every year after they breed, they have what they call a post-breeding wandering. And this year they decided to go about 1,000 miles farther north than they have gone before. I think they're up in Wisconsin or Michigan or someplace even farther north than we are. And nobody really knows why they wandered so much farther this year than usual. And we don't know if this is a pattern that will repeat itself. So it's sort of a natural phenomenon that kind of got out of control this year. And there are also white ibis are wandering farther north than they used to as well. And wood storks were seen farther north this year as well. So we don't completely know why. So it's something that all three of those species have always done, but for some reason they came farther north than usual. And stay tuned.
Well,
Maybe we'll get some
our
answers to that.
Seems to hang with all of our great egrets and seems very much at home during cocktail hour about 7 p.m.
Yep.
So
Yeah, it was really
it's just
fun.
fascinating to watch.
A lot of us really enjoyed that.
yeah, I was going to mention that is one of the spoonbills that was at Huntley Meadows since early summer. So it's one of the same ones. So
Yeah, they just showed up all kinds of crazy places.
yeah, well, he moved from Huntley Meadows to his current home. So,
Okay,
yeah.
great. So talk about some other water birds here. We've got loons, which are similar to grebes, but not related. We have pelicans, and then we have the bitterns, herons, and egrets, part of the family Ardeidae. We call them waders. We also call them colonial waterbirds. So gulls, terns, and long-legged wading birds are colonial nesters. So they nest in big groups, presumably for safety against predation. Ibises and spoonbills are in a different family from herons and egrets, but they're also considered long-legged waders and colonial waterbirds. Now, hawks and eagles in generally are not waterbirds except for the osprey and the bald eagle. And most of the hawks and eagles are related to each other, but ospreys are quite a bit different. And so they are usually recognized as their own family of raptors. And then again, kingfishers include kookaburras, and kookaburras are land-based kingfishers, and kingfishers are water-based kookaburras. So if you think about them worldwide, they're not all water birds, but almost all kingfishers are. And then among the songbirds, there are several different water birds. You could talk about salt marsh sparrow and seaside sparrow, but around here we have marsh wrens and red-winged blackbirds. So I'm going to try to cover all or most of these as we go kind of species by species. So most of these are permanent residents or breeders or winter residents, but blue-winged teals are true migrants. They come here in the spring and they come here in the fall. And there still should be some around. They've been here since September, but sometime in October or November, almost all of them will sneak out of here and head farther south, and they go down as far as South America. So they go farther south than most of our other water birds and waterfowl as well. So this is a male blue-winged teal. It's one of our prettier ducks. And teal, I'm not sure if it means small duck, but the teal are smaller than the other ducks that we have around here. And so the female looks a lot like a female mallard, but is a much smaller size. So we want to talk about the geese and swans first. The order Anseriformes, the family Anatidae, if you want to get ornithological about these things. And tundra swans, I think, is a lot of people's favorite bird, and they fly overhead in our area. So even if you're not on the Potomac, you can be inland, you can be in Washington, D.C., and oftentimes around dusk, they'll call as they fly overhead. And as I mentioned earlier, you can go to the Great Marsh Trail or the Wood Marsh Trail at Mason Neck National Wildlife Refuge from November to mid-March to see sometimes over 100 tundra swans wintering out in the bay there. So this is our tundra swan. There are other species of swans that look very similar. Occasionally we get a mute swan, which looks quite a bit different because it has a lot of red in the bill and it has a more curved neck. But most of what you'll see in our area is the tundra swan. So the really interesting thing about the tundra swan is they all breed out west, almost all in Alaska. And only the birds that breed on the North Shore of Alaska come here to the East Coast. So there's this huge migration route that crosses all the flyways. And there's a stopover site in, it's actually at the mouth, at the origin of the Mississippi River on the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin is a major stopover site for our tundra swans. And I think in both directions, but coming to and from Alaska, they stop over in the Midwest, so they don't fly nonstop that entire route. So Canada goose is everybody's best known type of waterfowl. And I am old enough to remember when people liked Canada geese. And that's because there used to not be Canada geese around here in the summertime. And so this time of year, all of a sudden you would hear the honking of the Canada geese, and it would mean that they were coming back from Canada. And there's an old Disney movie called Those Callaways that is kind of built around fall and the return of the Canada geese and what a lovely sound and how heartwarming it all is. Today, someone called them a flying pig. And people just don't like Canada geese anymore because they're on the golf courses, they're on the sidewalks, they leave their droppings behind, we step in them. And that happened because a couple hundred years ago, there were resident Canada geese, and the state game departments decided that They should reintroduce those populations. It could be a resource for hunting, and it was restoring something that had existed in the past that had been extirpated, and they just did not predict that these populations would grow out of control. Talk about some birds we like a little bit more. The wood duck. So these are all called dabbling ducks. And they're called dabbling ducks because they don't dive. Some people call them tip-up ducks. And sometimes the only thing you can see of these ducks is their butt up in the air. And you can stay and see their head because they do have to get their head up so they can breathe. But when their butt is up in the air, they are looking for food. And most of these, I think, are eating plant materials, and I'm sure they also pick up other invertebrates along with the plant materials, but these are primarily not fish-eating ducks. So wood duck is a lot of people's favorite duck. I grew up in Connecticut and almost never saw a wood duck. And so when I moved down here, I was delighted to see how common they are at Lake Fairfax Park here in Fairfax County. I had 20 wood ducks just the other day. And so they're very abundant. There are, of course, a lot of wood duck boxes out. I believe they're breeding at Dyke Marsh in wood duck boxes there. And that whole program has just been tremendously successful in restoring wood duck populations all through our area. They will disappear in the winter though. So if you see a wood duck in the winter, it's possible, but it's likely to be a single bird. And if you really wanted to see one in the middle of winter, you'd have to work really, really hard to find it. This is the shoveler. It looks superficially like a mallard, but look how big the beak is. And in fact, the bird is a little bit smaller than a mallard, and it's kind of longer and thinner than a mallard. So it's kind of a different shape. And this is the male. It has the kind of the cinnamon sides and the green head and the yellow eye, and then this big bill. This is the gadwall. The bird on top is the female gadwall, and she looks a lot like a female mallard, as do most of the dabbling ducks. But she's quite a bit smaller and often stays paired with the gadwall. And the gadwall is identified by the black butt and by the gray sides and front. And the really interesting patterning. So some of these dabbling ducks have this great patterning of kind of black and white that merges into a gray. And in this case, only the male has it. But when you see that, it's a pretty good sign that you have a gadwall, a little bit smaller than a mallard. These are widgeon. You can see the female looks a lot like a female gadwall. She's got the grayer head, and the male is often called a bald pate. So the hunter's term for males and the term 70 years ago was bald pate because of the white crown on the male. And again, you can see some of those really finely detailed feathers on the widgeon, which separates the male from the female. And there's our trusty mallard. They lose their plumage for a month or two in August and September, but I think they're all getting back their full adult plumage now. And they will start to harass the females now. So that's what the green head is to attract the females for harassment. And this is the female mallard, which I show here because we're going to talk about the difference between mallards and black ducks. And there's the black duck. Now, if you look side by side like this, oh my goodness, they don't look anything alike at all. The black duck is really chocolatey, not really black, but very chocolatey, dark. The head is lighter than the body. And that color on the wing is, in a mallard, has a white border to it. It's called the speculum. In the mallard, it has a white border to it. In the black duck, it does not have a white border. Now, the interesting thing is that 100 years ago, it was all black ducks in this area, and there are basically either no or very few mallards. And again, just like the Canada goose, the game department, the state game department, has decided that hunters really liked mallards as their favorite target. And so they introduced mallards all through the Northeast United States. And lo and behold, the black duck females got seduced by that green head or were coerced by that green head into mating with mallards. And so in our area and all through the Northeast United States, there are a lot of hybrids between black ducks and mallards, and many more mallards now than black ducks, but they're still often found in flocks together. They prefer very similar shallow wetlands, as do most of these dabbling ducks, and both can be found all through the winter. This is one of the prettiest of the dabbling ducks. It's very dainty with a thin neck, and the male especially looks dainty because of that white stripe up the back of the neck. And again, you've got this dappled plumage, gray and white, and the super pintail with black underneath, fancy black and white feathers on the back. I mean, there's just a lot of things going for it. And of course, the female doesn't get that. She looks like a tan mallard with a thin neck. And again, oftentimes the female pintails will hang with the males. Otherwise, they're a little bit smaller than a mallard, and they look much thinner, and that tall neck kind of sticks out. And the tan color helps you to tell that they're not mallards. This is a green-winged teal. It looks like a huge duck. It is not. It is probably our smallest duck that we have in the area. This is the male green-winged teal. And you could also call it green-headed teal if you wanted to, but it has that green ear patch. And the green wing is just the speculum. So it's just the square patch on the wing, not the whole wing. And again, you see the dabbling duck pattern. In this case, a little white at the back. And the female really does look just like a tiny mallard. Very tough to tell apart, and tough to tell the female blue-winged teals from the female green-winged teals, although blue-winged teal is a different shape and something you can learn to identify over time. So mallard and wood duck are year-round. Others are just starting to trickle in. You'll have a big arrival soon. So when cold fronts pass, these birds come in. So when the cold front came through on Saturday afternoon, I went out on Sunday, and there are a whole bunch of wood ducks that I hadn't seen before. So other ducks will start arriving kind of with each cold front. And then, as I mentioned before, when Canada ice is over, we'll get a big arrival. Sometimes on a Christmas bird count on the 20th of December, there'll be a huge flight just because they had cold weather up north and a whole bunch of lakes and ponds iced over, and a bunch of birds decided to come farther south. And that can just happen anytime all through the winter, depending on when the cold weather hits north of us. When bays ice over, most of our birds escape. Occasionally a swan or some other bird will get stuck in the ice, but usually they can anticipate it and sneak out of there and find open water. So the other thing you want to do is in the springtime is keep your eyes open for when the ice melts. And of course, that's earlier and earlier every year. So sometime in February or March, we have a big ice melt, and you get this huge influx of ducks. And if you miss that huge influx, the ducks will just keep on going north, and you can miss the spring migration because they will go as far north as the ice will let them go. And then by the end of April, there's hardly any waterfowl left. They all want to be up north on their breeding grounds, except of course the mallards and the Canada geese and the wood ducks that are breeding here. So now we're going to talk about diving ducks. And
Hey,
there
Greg,
are four.
may I interrupt you for a minute to
Sure,
ask
please.
a question from the chat box?
Yeah, please.
Elizabeth Lanoff asked, do great marsh swan feathers ever reach the shore? And if so, can you keep them for making quills?
So yes, I'm sure those feathers do wash ashore. I haven't seen one myself. And I have to tell you that it's illegal to collect those feathers. As a federal employee, it is my duty to say it is illegal to collect the feather of any migratory bird. So you can collect chicken feathers or starling feathers or house sparrow feathers, but not of any native wild bird. You might ask, how often is that rule enforced? And I can't answer that. I would say not always. And you're certainly less likely to be in trouble for single feathers than if you have an entire wing or an entire bird's worth of feathers. If you find a carcass of a dead bird, sometimes a local museum would be interested, and those museums have permits that allow them to have bird carcasses and bird feathers. And so it is a permitted system that you can get if you belong to a museum or some other organization that has a need for feathers or bird bodies. Okay, I will go on and talk about bay ducks then, as one of the kinds of diving ducks. It's pretty common around here. And we have canvasbacks and redheads and ringneck ducks and greater scaup and lesser scaup. So we'll talk about those a bit. So canvasback is on the left here, and it's, again, a lot of people really like this bird because it has kind of a unique shape. It's got that sloping forehead and kind of a sloping beak as well. And you can see it looks a lot like the redhead on the right, but the redhead has a very rounded head and looks kind of more like a mallard shape. They both have black lower fronts, but the redhead has a gray back and the canvasback has a white back. They both have the black rump. The other thing about the redhead is it has a little bit of a ring on its bill. And so that's another good way to tell them apart. The females are more difficult to tell apart, and that's for a different talk. If I showed you Belmont Bay, which is visible from Occoquan Bay National Wildlife Refuge and from Mason Neck State Park. And there's thousands of lesser scaup in the wintertime. So at least starting in December and January and February, there may be 4,000, 5,000 lesser scaup. So that's the bird on the left. And you can sort of tell it is different from the bird on the right when they're side by side. But of course, they're not always side by side. Greater scaup prefers saltwater and is more likely to be found out on Chesapeake Bay. And lesser scaup prefers freshwater and is more likely to be found as you get farther west on the Potomac River. So thousands and thousands of lesser scaup. If you have a good telescope and you get close to them, you can often find a greater scaup mixed in, maybe one for every 100, maybe one for every 1,000 lesser scaup. There'll be greater scaup. So if you want to see both, you can do it nearby, but you're guaranteed to see both if you go farther out into Chesapeake Bay. And again, the females look different. They have the same head shape, which really helps a lot. So this is ringneck duck. It looks a lot like the scaup, but you can see the scaup have those light gray backs, and this ringneck duck has a very black back. It also has pronounced rings on the bill. So that's the female on the right, the male on the left, and a kind of an interesting head shape, a little bit like a lesser scaup head shape, but even more dramatic. And it's a fairly common duck. It's not as common as lesser scaup, but it's kind of a little bit more widespread. So a duck you can frequently see on ponds and the Potomac River and the tributaries to the Potomac in our area. Potomac River diving ducks arrive around November, depart end of March, and move south or towards the coast when the Potomac bays are iced over. So sea ducks, they're called sea ducks because they're way more common in Chesapeake Bay or the Atlantic Ocean than they are here, but we do see some of them here, so that's why I'm including them in this talk. The bufflehead is a pretty tiny duck. I didn't compare its size to green-winged teal and bufflehead. I'll look that up after we're done and see which is smaller, but these are very tiny ducks, the male on the right, the female on the left. And even though I call them sea ducks, they're very common in the Potomac River bays. So Belmont Bay has lots and lots of them. Powick Bay almost always has buffleheads, and these open bays just have them. They're really fun ducks. And I'll talk about in a minute, they have this courtship display where they bob their head up and down. The males bob their head up and down, and the females presumably are overwhelmed by this display and become willing to mate with them. Of course, the males start bobbing way before the breeding season, but it's a good sign of spring because they do it when it still seems like winter to me. A little bit similar in terms of the coloration are the common goldeneye. And they're not really common on the Potomac River, but they're expected. And you can often find, several individuals, male on the right, female on the left. There's another bird called Barrow's goldeneye, which sometimes shows up in places like Ocean City, Maryland, often on the Atlantic Ocean, near docks or jetties or places like that. But we don't get Barrow's goldeneyes. I'm not sure if you've ever had them on the Potomac River, but they're exceedingly rare, and the one you expect is the Barrow's goldeneye. And The male does have a golden eye, and so it really isn't named after the white spot on the face. It looks like a fake eye. And the female has a white eye, but she's still called a golden eye. And as I say, they look a little bit similar to the bufflehead, but you can see the bufflehead, the female bufflehead, the place of the white spot is very different from the male golden eye. And the male bufflehead has the white on the back of the head, which is important because I'm going to show you a hooded merganser, which also has white on the back of the head. But on a hooded merganser, the white is outlined in black. So another kind of diving duck we have is a merganser, and these mergansers are fish-eating ducks. All the ones we've talked about before, these sea ducks often are eating like clams and mussels and things like that. But these mergansers are fish-eating ducks, and I'll show you their bill, which is good for fish eating. So here's the hooded merganser, and the male, as I say, has white on the back of the head like a bufflehead, but it has a black outline. It also has a brown side, and it has that really long, thin merganser bill with like sawtoothing on it, which you can see on the male a little bit to grab hold of the fish and keep hold of the fish. The female looks the same shape as the male. She looks a little bit brown, but that if you see that tannish crest floating out back, she's actually pretty easy to identify, even if there's not a male around. And these birds are in close to shore, so sometimes you'll see them even in with dabbling ducks, because they like to fish close to shore in smaller bays and in estuaries. This is the common merganser. It's a little bit bigger than the hooded merganser. Again, you might think of a mallard because of that green head, but immediately you see that bright red bill. And so that's a merganser, and it's a long, thin bill with serrations for grabbing onto a fish. And it's just this bold white color. It's got a bold white neck. It's got a bold white side, and then a little bit of black and gray on the back. The female looks a whole lot like the male, except that her head is tan instead of green. And she's got, you know, kind of a really nice feathery back to her head that the male tends not to show. And she's quite a bit different from the female hooded merganser because she's got the white and the gray, where the hooded merganser is just kind of tan and brown all over. So similar feathery head, but otherwise looking quite different. And then, and then these are bay ducks. So these common mergansers are found in the big open bays. And then we have these red-breasted mergansers, which again are mostly sea mergansers. They're usually found in the Atlantic Ocean or in the Chesapeake Bay near the ocean, but we get several show up here on the Potomac River, and they can be told from the common mergansers because they have they don't have that white neck that the common merganser has. And the male common merganser has more feathery on the head, so it doesn't have that smooth green head that the common merganser has. And the female is a little bit smaller and not as contrasty as the female common merganser, and much rarer. If you find these here, you might even be asked to document what you saw because they're so much rarer than the common merganser or the hooded. Another common duck we have is all by itself. It's not very closely related to the other ducks. It's the ruddy duck, and the lower right-hand picture is what they look like in breeding season. So in March or April, they get this blue bill and this beautiful cinnamon color, and they start bobbing their heads up and down just like the buffleheads do in their courtship display. The upper left-hand bird is a winter male, a ruddy duck. It's got a nice bright white cheek, so it really sticks out. And again, that white patch is in a different place from where the bufflehead or the goldeneye has a white patch. So that helps you to tell the difference. Now, if you're lucky, the ruddy duck will stick its tail up in the air, and then you know for sure it's a ruddy duck, but you can notice in these pictures, these two birds, they're not sticking their tail up in the air, and so you have to identify them anyway. The female ruddy duck looks a whole lot like the male. They have kind of a funny head shape. They're very small compared to other ducks that they're in with. And the female has a little line through her cheek. So she's got a little white above the line, a little white below the line, nowhere near as contrasty as the male ruddy duck. And these are also fish-eating ducks, I believe. I'm not positive of that, but they do a lot of diving. So sometimes in wintertime, they're so hungry, they don't spend a lot of time above the water. So you gotta be careful. If you're really into identifying water birds, I recommend buying a telescope or becoming best friends with somebody that has a telescope, because if you're standing at Mason Neck State Park trying to see the birds on Belmont Bay, you need a telescope to really identify all the birds you can see. And even then you can't identify them all. They can be pretty far away. So again, one of the really early signs of spring in our area is duck courtship behavior. Mallards not only court the females, they chase females, they actually rape females. They grab the back of their neck and put their head underwater. So if anyone tells you that birds are models of behavior, tell them about the mallard. It's not something humans should be mimicking. There's some really interesting duck calls. The American widgeon has a really interesting whistle, as does the long-tailed duck. I should have brought those sounds with me, but I forgot. But you can probably get on the internet and try to get a widgeon call and a long-tailed duck call. They do not quack, so don't ever expect a widgeon or a duck or a long-tailed duck to quack. Mallards and black ducks both quack. I'm not sure you can tell those quacks apart from each other. But anyway, different ducks have different sounds. And again, they're more common in the springtime because it tends to be part of courtship behavior. And then head bobbing is a really common courtship behavior among a lot of different ducks. And again, you can go on the internet and find videos of duck courtship behavior, and it can really be fun. Long-tailed duck, the whole courtship thing is really, really interesting. Common golden-eye ruddy duck as well. All these birds have some great videos on the internet that you can visit. Okay, I'm going to stop for questions again about the waterfowl and their behavior. And we're going to go on to other water birds after this set of questions. So I don't know if people want to unmute and just ask, or if Carolyn wants to read a few.
So no additional questions, just a couple comments.
Okay.
Dixie noted that they saw some northern pintails and ruddy ducks at Huntley Meadows on Monday, and also ruddy ducks at Dyke Marsh Walk on Sunday. So winter birds starting to arrive.
Indeed.
Hey, Greg, I was going to mention the hooded mergansers are kind of an odd anomaly, because they breed here at Huntley Meadows and then they just leave for several months and then they come back again in the winter.
Oh, I didn't know they left. Any idea where they're going?
Kurt told me once, maybe Pennsylvania. Yeah, there's not many hoodies at Huntley Meadows for several months. Yeah, they just leave.
Yeah, it's interesting. I knew they bred there. I know they winter here, and I hadn't realized that, you know,
Yeah.
I thought maybe I was the only one who wasn't seeing them.
No, they leave.
Cool.
Yeah.
Any other questions, or should I move on? Okay, I will move on. Okay, this
I
is
had a
not a
question.
duck. So the birds I'm going to be talking about from now on are not ducks, but this is the one that you have to be most wary of. A lot of people, this is an American coot. Males and females look exactly the same. The young birds look quite a bit different. So if you see a coot in the summertime, you can find some that look very different. But in wintertime here, there can be 1,000 of them in one group, especially on Belmont Bay or Pohick Bay. The eagles love to harass the coots. And so young eagles especially will dive bomb the coots over and over again. And so they just get in tighter and tighter flocks until you can see no water between the coots. You can have 1,000 coots so tightly packed, you can't see any water among them. But they look like a duck. They look especially like a ruddy duck or something like that, but they have the white bill, dark head, and gray body. And so, and they're kind of like a tip-up duck. So they tend to stick their beak underwater for feeding, but nowhere even, they're related to rails. They're not related to ducks at all, they're related to rails. This is a common loon. which can be fairly common, especially in Belmont Bay. I know I've seen, you can see 8 to 10 loons in a day in Belmont Bay and other places on the Potomac River. And if you go to the Atlantic Ocean, if you go to like a place like Chincoteague or other, the Outer Banks, there's often a common loon every 100 yards, all the way down to Florida and all the way along the Gulf of Mexico, every 100 yards along the beaches, common loons. And of course, they winter along our coasts near the shore, and then they will change their color completely in April, and then they'll fly north into Canada or northern Vermont or the Adirondacks of New York State, breed up there, and then come back, presumably right around now. This is a horned grebe, and I don't know, I felt like it's been really rare the last few years. 15 years ago when I first came here, you'd see 10 or a dozen out in Belmont Bay. And I've been there several times last year, winter, when I didn't see any. And I know they're still here, but for some reason, these numbers seem to be down. Again, this is winter plumage. They have a gorgeous spring plumage, which we only see in April or May. So if I give this talk in the springtime, I'll try to include that plumage. But you see, they've got a very white cheek and a very white neck. And so they really stick out that way. There are other grebes that look similar. There's a redneck grebe and an ear grebe, which are very rare around here. And so most of the small grebes you see around here are either pied-bill grebes or this bird, and pied-bill grebes look very different, which I think is next. Yeah, so pied-bill grebe is a very brown and tan bird, another tiny bird, smaller than I think all the ducks. They don't always have the pied bill, so that's not a good field mark. But you can see pied-bill grebes with no ring around the bill at all. But otherwise, they have this funny little shape. They look a little different shape from horned grebe, but it's kind of a grebey shape and very different from a loon or a coot or a duck. And pied-bills are very common here. They like smaller bays. They are out in Belmont Bay as well. So they really like our region and can be quite abundant at times. Gulls are water birds too. And here are gulls that are really easy to identify. Upper left-hand corner is a great blackback gull. When you go to the coast, you have to keep your eyes open for lesser blackback gull. And the adults have yellow legs instead of pink legs. And the back isn't quite as dark as on a great blackback gull. And they're the same size. The lesser blackback gull is the same size as a herring gull, which is lower left-hand corner. Great blackback gull is bigger than a herring gull. Great blackback gulls are a little bit rare here, but you can still see, multiple individuals in a day. When there's a lot of ice, they're out on the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. Herring gulls get very common on the Potomac River in wintertime, but year-round, the most common gull around here is the ring-billed gull, which is smaller than the herring gull and has the yellow legs just like a lesser blackback gull would have. The adults always have the ring bill. The adult of the herring gull always has that little red spot on the bill. And then comes the fun. The fun is that we get immature gulls, and immature gulls all look alike, and teaching you how to identify immature gulls is beyond the scope of this discussion. There are 2-hour videos which focus on how to identify immature gulls. It is something you can conquer if you want to. I have friends who are really good at this. And if I sit in front of my bird book for an hour or two before I go out gulling, I can convince myself that I can do it myself. The easiest thing to do in this plumage is just look at the size. You can see how big the beak is in the upper left-hand side for the great blackback gull. And again, the herring gull has a bigger beak than the ring-billed gull. So there are always hints, but it's just tough to identify immature gulls. And then these gulls take 2, 3, or 4 years to get into the adult plumage. So there's all kinds of intermediates between this plumage and the full adult plumage. So like I say, you can spend an entire lifetime specializing in identifying every plumage of gulls. And some people find it very, very rewarding. And of course, we are in a huge, great area for bald eagles, especially Mason Neck has a real density of bald eagle nests. We're in the nation's capital, and you can walk around DC and almost always see a bald eagle every day. You're in Washington, DC, or Alexandria, or Arlington or Dyke Marsh. At Dyke Marsh, you probably hard pressed not to see 6 bald eagles in a trip to Dyke Marsh. The adults are males and females, look the same, the white head and the white tail. The young ones look really, really different. Again, they take 4 or 5 years to come to this full adult plumage. And so there's some really dark immature bald eagles that just have little white speckling on them, all the way to full white heads and full white tails, everything in between. Now, starting in November, there's a chance for a golden eagle to fly by. And I'm not sure if they've ever been seen on the Potomac River. I assume they have very, very rarely. But a golden eagle is solid brown. A young golden eagle has a little white at the base of the tail and a little white at the base of the wings, but it's a solid patch of white. So they look quite different from even an immature bald eagle. And they're quite common. Well, they're not common, but they do winter near Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland and in the Adirondack Mountains. So they're all golden eagles passing by through the month of November. And again, they head north in the month of March and winter somewhere not too far from us in between. Ospreys, of course, a lot of people's favorite bird because they nest out in the open. We can watch them. They come back late February or March and build nests all through the Potomac River, all through the Chesapeake Bay, all along the Atlantic Ocean. And there's a huge competition between eagles and ospreys. And so they tend not to nest in places like Mason Neck where there's so many eagles because the eagles are stronger and more powerful and can overwhelm them at a nest. Whereas in flight, the osprey is more maneuverable and they can sometimes steal a fish from a bald eagle because they can outmaneuver it. So it's power versus maneuverability when ospreys and bald eagles are fighting over fish. Don't know what happened there. Oh, I know, there's supposed to be a least bittern here. Darn. Least bittern is a specialty bird of Dyke Marsh. And so I found a great picture of a least bittern. And you can see it's hiding in the reed grasses like always. So 9 times out of 10, you go to Dyke Marsh to see a least bittern, and this is what you see, not a least bittern. Of course, what you usually see is cattails because they like to spend their time in the cattails and other emergent vegetation. I know that if you go out in a kayak, you could find them throughout the breeding season because they're still nesting in Dyke Marsh, which is fantastic. Sorry about that. Great blue heron on the left and a great egret on the right. Great blue herons are here year-round. There are heronries nearby. I don't know of a great egret rookery. Maybe Dixie or Larry can tell us where there's a great egret rookery nearby. But after the breeding season, they show up and they're usually still here into October, but there's often a lot fewer by now because they're starting to head south. They do this post-breeding wandering like we were talking about for roseate spoonbill and wood stork. The egrets have, great egrets have always showed up here in numbers in July and August and September. And now they've got company from birds that used to be much rarer. Great blue herons year round. They disappear in the winter if ice forms along the edges of our tributaries and ponds, but they will be here if it's not iced over. And they'll come back after the ice. Okay, so now we're to our songbirds that are water birds. Red-winged blackbirds love cattails, as you can see on the left. The males are polygynous. So they, one male will defend a territory. And one great place to watch them is the Great Marsh at Mason Neck National Wildlife Refuge. On either of those overlooks, you can see a bunch of red-winged blackbirds out there. There's least bitterns breeding out there as well. And of course, at Dyke Marsh, you can see the red-wings as well. And you'll see one male always sitting out in the open, singing his heart out, conqueree, conqueree, conqueree. And then the females trying to hide in the cattails have nests. They have, they lay the eggs, they build the nest, they feed the young. And the males will often help with the first brood, but kind of half-heartedly because they're always on the lookout for another female to mate with. And so they're not great helpers. but they do defend the territory, and they let everybody know if there's some kind of a predator coming by, and they're always advertising for the next mate. We do have redwings here in the wintertime. I don't see very many males, but there are often flocks of like 40 or 50 females flying around. And Dyke Marsh is a place where you can get a flock of 40 or 50 females. When they're all by themselves, a lot of people think they're sparrows, but the beak is different. That streaking is different from the streaking you might see on a song sparrow. And so you should be able to learn to tell them apart. And often there's immature males in with the females, and the immature males look like kind of a cross between the male on the left and the female on the right. They've got a little bitty red patch on their shoulder. Some females do as well. And they're just a little bit darker than the females, and sometimes mixed in with those all-female flocks that we have in the wintertime. So I love birds. I love to go bird watching, but we have an obligation. Birds are in trouble these days. There's a report out from last year about 3 billion birds lost. And some of the most common birds in North America are declining. Red-winged blackbirds are a big example. Common grackles are another example of super common birds that nonetheless have lost up to 30%, up to 50% of their population over the last 50 years. And we know this because of the Breeding Bird Survey and other bird surveys that have been done. And so we need to all contribute to conservation if we want there to be bird watchers and healthy humans in the future. So I want you to know I made this slide before I knew I was giving this talk. The number one thing I suggest people do is help the restoration of Dyke Marsh. I think the work you're doing at Dyke Marsh is setting an example for the rest of the area. And I really enjoy watching your progress, and twist my arm, I need to come out and help you. I haven't done that, but I really should do that. I would like to do that. So please invite me. When you're restoring wetlands, it's important to keep a balance of open water, marsh plants like cattails, and mudflats. So some birds are in the open water, some shorebirds, especially sandpipers and plovers, use the mudflats, and then least bitterns and marsh wrens. I also had a picture of a marsh wren that got lost somehow, are in the cattails. They're not so much in the, I'll talk about that in a second. They're not so much in the Phragmites, but they are definitely in the cattails. Everyone who's planting, whether in wetlands or upland, should be planting native plants and plants that have been shown to be bird friendly or butterfly friendly. Audubon Society of Northern Virginia has an Audubon at Home program that's been around for about 20 years. And we have ambassadors from the Audubon at Home program that will come to your yard or a public property or a homeowners association property and give free advice. Now, how often does that happen? Someone will come to your place, give you free advice, and if you agree to follow their advice, they will give you a certification. And you can get a proud certificate to show that you are Audubon at Home property. And again, they'll come to an individual's home. They will come to a homeowners association. They'll do it at a public property. Any of those can be certified. And in the process, you can get good advice and improve the habitat for birds and other wildlife and insects, beneficial insects. So unfortunately, even before you can plant native plants, sometimes we have to get rid of the non-native invasive species, NNIs. And in wetlands especially, we're very worried about purple loosestrife and Phragmites. And both, purple loosestrife is one of the prettiest plants on the planet, and so it still gets sold in nurseries. Please don't buy it, even if you want to use it in upland areas, because it just escapes and takes over. And when it's in a wetland area, it helps convert wetlands to uplands. Same thing with Phragmites. You have these huge, huge landscapes where nothing but Phragmites or reed plants, and they're converting wetlands to uplands. And in the process, it just becomes a much less productive place. So Phragmites supports great birds in England where it's native. It does not support very many birds in the wintertime. Sometimes they get a huge flock of blackbirds or starlings that'll winter in the Phragmites, and they get some protection out of it, but that's about it. Now, you can't scream about all the non-native plants because hydrilla is non-native, and it is attracting ducks and shorebirds. So that may be the exception to the rule, but we can have good conversations about that long into the night. It's really important to avoid pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. If you go to a big box store, you can buy a native plant where the seeds have been pre-treated with pesticides. And so you're buying the native plant, so it'll attract native insects, so it'll attract native birds. And it turns out you ended up buying a plant that has pesticides on it, and it won't attract anything. So there are native plant specialty stores in the area. A lot of the, Virginia Native Plant Society has special sales where you can buy native plants, where you can be sure that it hasn't been treated by a pesticide, and you can be in a good place. And we're having a conversation today about trying to get rid of your lawn. Oh, probably should put a picture of it, but try to get rid of your lawn and plant it native. There are ways to make a native plant yard beautiful so your neighbors don't complain too much. But anyway, anything we can do to get rid of non-native plants like Bermuda grass and replace it with native plants is going to be good for all the birds. And of course, fertilizers are a problem throughout our neighborhoods because they get into the runs, which get into the creeks, which get into the streams, which get into the Potomac River, which get into the Chesapeake Bay, which gets into the Atlantic Ocean. And the runoff from fertilizer is one of the huge contributions. Obviously, human sewage. There's agricultural lands that are contributing to runoff, but our backyards where we're overusing fertilizers, or our friends' backyards that are overusing fertilizers, can be a big problem as well. And then, as I said, I love the work you're doing. It's going to take a lot of volunteers to clean up, improve the native habitats, to get rid of the trash that's found along the Potomac River. And so any of these projects you can support are fantastic. Friends of Dyke Marsh is great. There are other friends groups. There's Mason Neck, and there's Audubon Society of Northern Virginia. In Prince William County, there's organizations as well. So join these groups and let's do more conservation work so that when the birds are flying into our areas, they find better places to stay, and people have a healthier environment to live in as well. Some of these things we can do on our own just by volunteering and recycling and doing things at home. Other things require political action. And if you know Glenda, you can ask Glenda what political action is most important to take today. Tomorrow the answer might be a little bit different, but we should probably take action on every one of these days. And to get politicians interested in nature will mean that they will listen to us more when we talk to them about a serious issue, if they know how beautiful the environment in Northern Virginia can be, and they know that you are all contributing so much to making it a better place. So thanks for listening, and look forward to a little bit of conversation.
Hi, Greg. There was one question in the chat that I think got answered, but I'll just ask it again. Stacy Langsdale asked, she said she applied for the Audubon at-home program early in COVID more than a year ago, but hasn't heard back, and asked if they're still backlogged.
They were really badly backlogged, and I think they may have just dropped the ball on a few people who reached out. So start again, because there may be a small backlog, but it's nothing like it was at the beginning. But I do think a few invitations got dropped early on. So.
Yeah. And I said I would check with them and ask the Audubon home leaders to get in touch with Stacy.
Cool. But yeah, feel free to reach out now, because things are back up and running, and most of the ambassadors are visiting now. And we'd really love to get more properties improved, especially the closer you are to a creek, a run, a river, a stream, all this water that's feeding into Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic and comes by us through the Potomac. Anything that's potentially running off there, the more native plants and the less fertilizers, just gonna make a huge difference for this ecosystem.
And Joanne and Powell Hutton put in the chat a link to plantnovanatives.org for people who are looking for help establishing habitat with native plants.
Those people are great. And of course, there's also master naturalists and master gardeners all through our area. So there's no shortage of well-trained people with good advice. Someone said LWC, which is Loudon Wildlife Conservancy. So if you live a little bit west, the Loudon Wildlife Conservancy is a really great organization. I forget, it's Prince William Environmental Council, I think is the group in Prince William County. So yeah, there's just a lot of
Prince
volunteer
William
groups.
Conservation Alliance.
Say that, Larry?
Prince William Conservation Alliance.
Thank you, yeah.
There you go.
It's good to have knowledgeable people here to help me out. I appreciate it. Other questions? Any statements?
Tom Maroney asked, where exactly is LaGrange Lane area? And again, I believe that was in King George County in northern.
I think that was Larry knew that one. Can you tell us?
Yeah, it's along, what is that? The road.
It's Route 3, I think.
Yeah, off Route 3 west, east of Fredericksburg. But before you get to the George Washington birthplace, there's several farms there. There's a couple of big farms, and then it's there. You can find it. And no parking. You have to stay on the road though. So that's a rule there.
Yeah, so you can practice using your telescope outside your car window with your car window.
Well, you can get out and stand on the road. It's not,
Okay.
it's not a busy road.
There's no traffic.
No. Mhm.
Yeah, and the George Washington birthplace, it's a national park property, and it is just lovely. There's a couple of, there's where the house is that overlooks Pope's Creek and the going into the Potomac. And then they have a road that goes out past their little cemetery clear to the river. So you would be on the river bank and you can kind of scan the river from there. And that sometimes is really good.
Yeah. Lots of swans there too.
Oh, cool. Someone asked about a spotting scope. I know Nikon has a good inexpensive spotting scope and Vortex does as well. So those are two you could look at. Or if you want to spend several $1,000s, you can go to Zeiss or Leica or
Swarovski.
Swarovski.
Yeah.
So you won't believe what the price can be for the top of the line, but the Nikon and the Vortex are really, really good.
Yeah.
For more like $500. And then the question is, do you know what happened to the eagle couple? Does anybody have an update on the eagle couple? I think.
Which eagle couple?
Are you talking about the ones at Dyke Marsh?
Were they lost at Dyke Marsh? Oh, just below Old Town, near Dyke Marsh. There we go.
At the golf
George
course?
Washington Parkway.
At the
Yeah.
golf course?
That's been a long time ago. They tried to nest in a tree right by the parkway. And I think this is several years ago. I think the theory was that those were a young pair, and they, when they first start out, they don't quite know what they're doing. And their nest failed, and you'll sometimes see eagles perched in that tree, but there's no nesting going on. But at Dyke Marsh, there's a pair that's been very successful the last 2 or 3 years that have a nest right on the Hall Road.
Right.
So you can actually see the nest. When the young eagles get big enough, you can see them standing up on the edge of the nest and practicing their wing flapping and things like that. I think this past summer or past winter and spring, they raised 2 young that fledged. So I don't know if that's the same pair that tried to nest on the parkway or not. There's another nest down by Morningside Lane. And, the thing is, all along the Potomac on both Maryland and Virginia side, a lot of land was set aside for eagle nesting, like the refuge down at Mason Neck. And it's been very successful, which is why more than half the time when I go on a bird walk, I see a bald eagle. Just pretty special.
Mhm.
Okay, I think we've probably gone over our time here, and I really appreciate everyone's questions. and all the answers. I just will re-emphasize the point that Greg made about everyone's effort counts. If you can plant a few native plants that support our native insects and birds, that can make a big difference. If you can come out and help us fill up a bag of stilt grass, that's wonderful. You'll be amazed at how much fun it is, how rewarding it is. And then if you talk to an elected official or a candidate for 10 minutes, I think you'd be surprised at how interested they are and how uninformed they are and need to be educated. And we have an election coming up soon and there's a lot at stake. So this is a good opportunity to express your conservation concerns. So Greg, do you have anything else? I think we need to wind it up now.
No, I think that's great. Thanks for listening, and go out and enjoy the waterfowl. The season is
Yeah,
is
thank you
starting
so
now.
much. I feel like we just had a college course and I have to go take an exam, but no, it was very informative. Thank you so much.
So I may repeat in January if people want to be part of the winter waterfowl count. I often will focus on the identification part of this to get people ready for the winter waterfowl count.
Mhm. Okay, good.